The silence in the room was worse than shouting. Sovian Ashgrove stood 3 paces behind the last row of chairs, her fingers locked together beneath the fold of her shawl, watching the Duke of Hatherglen hold her work in his hands. He didn't know it was hers. No one in this room knew. That was the arrangement, the only condition under which a woman's analysis would ever reach the desk of the most powerful estate holder in the county. He turned a page, then another. His expression shifted from mild interest to something sharper, more focused, the look of a man encountering an argument he hadn't expected to find persuasive. The morning light from the tall study windows caught the edge of the document, and Sovienne could see the dense columns of figures she'd calculated by candlelight over 6 sleepless nights. Yield projections, drainage costs, tenant revenue forecasts, the mathematical architecture of an estate on the verge of collapse, and the precise sequence of interventions that could save it. "This is exceptional work," the Duke said. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She kept her face perfectly still. He was addressing the room, which contained 4 men: Mr. Aldrich Pemberton, his estate solicitor, who had commissioned the report under false pretenses; Sir Gavin Naismith, a neighboring landowner with interests in the outcome; Mr. Collis, the estate's aging steward, who'd been quietly failing at his duties for years; and Jonathan Ashgrove, Sovien's brother, who sat in the corner, looking simultaneously terrified and proud, because Jonathan was the name on the report. Jonathan, who could barely add a column of figures without losing his place. Jonathan, who had come to her 6 weeks ago with desperation in his eyes. "Pemberton needs someone to audit the Hatherglen accounts," he'd said. "The estate's hemorrhaging money since the old Duke died. The fee would clear their debts twice over, and Sovienne had said the obvious thing. Then you should do it." "I can't. You know I can't. I don't have your mind for numbers, Sovie. I never did. You're the one Father trained." Their father, Edmund Ashgrove, had been a brilliant estate manager before a riding accident left him unable to work. He'd poured everything he knew into his children, but it was Sovienne who'd absorbed it, who'd spent her girlhood bent over ledgers and crop rotation charts, while other girls learned watercolors. She could read an estate's health the way a physician read a pulse, instinctively, precisely, with a clarity that made complex problems feel simple. But she was a woman, and estate analysis was, as everyone in this room would agree, a man's work. So Jonathan's name went on the report. Jonathan collected the commission. Jonathan sat in this study now, accepting praise for work he couldn't have produced in a lifetime of trying. And Sovienne stood behind the chairs, invisible, introduced only as my sister, who accompanied me from the country. A chaperone, a decoration, a nobody. "The drainage analysis alone is worth the commission," the Duke continued, and Sovienne watched him trace the exact paragraph where she'd identified the catastrophic flaw in the Southfield irrigation. His finger moved along her words, her reasoning, and her solution. Whoever compiled these figures has an extraordinary grasp of hydraulic engineering as applied to agricultural yield. I've consulted with 3 London firms, and none of them identified this issue. "Thank you, Your Grace." Jonathan's voice was steady, which surprised Sovienne. He'd been practicing his delivery for 2 days. "The South Fields were the most concerning element. The drainage pattern has been slowly destroying topsoil for at least a decade, possibly longer." Those were her words, rehearsed, memorized, and delivered by her brother, like lines in a play. "Mr. Ashgrove, I'll be direct." The Duke set the report on his desk and turned to face Jonathan fully. He was younger than Sovienne had expected from the correspondence, perhaps 31 or 32, with dark auburn hair and gray eyes that held a quality she found unsettling. Not coldness exactly, but a relentless precision, as if he were constantly measuring the distance between what people said and what they meant. This report demonstrates a level of analytical capability that frankly surprises me, given your reputation." The room went very quiet. "I mean no offense," the Duke added, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if offense was taken. "But I've made inquiries. Your previous work consists primarily of minor bookkeeping for a wool merchant in Chelmsford, and an incomplete survey of barley yields for Lord Huxley that was, by his account, riddled with errors." Jonathan's composure cracked, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional shift in posture. But Sauvienne saw it. And worse, the Duke saw it. "This report," the Duke lifted the document, "contains no errors. I've checked. Every calculation, every projection, every recommendation is precise and defensible. So either you've undergone a remarkable transformation in competence, or this is not entirely your work." The silence was suffocating. Sir Gavin shifted in his seat. Mr. Collis studied his shoes. Pemberton, who knew the truth because Pemberton had arranged the entire charade, kept his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace," Jonathan began, but the Duke raised a hand. "I'm not interested in evasions, Mr. Ashgrove. I'm interested in the mind that produced this analysis, because that mind understands my estate better than anyone I've consulted, and I need that mind working on the solution, not simply diagnosing the problem." He paused. "So I'll ask plainly, did you write this report yourself, entirely and without assistance?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Sauvienne's pulse hammered in her throat. If Jonathan confessed, the commission would be voided. They'd lose everything. If he lied, and the Duke later discovered the truth, the consequences would be worse. Much worse. Dukes had long memories and longer reach. Jonathan opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Pemberton, who offered nothing, looked at the floor, and then, because Jonathan had always been better at meaning well than at following through, he told the truth. "My sister wrote it." Every head in the room turned toward Sauvienne. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, pressing against her chest, pinning her in place. The Duke's gray eyes found hers across the study, and she saw something flash through them. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "I see," he said. Then he picked up the report, walked past every man in the room, and stopped directly in front of her. "Miss Ashgrove, Your Grace, you wrote this." He held up the document, not a question. "Yes. The drainage analysis, the yield projections, the tenant restructuring proposal, all of it. All of it." He studied her face with that unnerving precision, as if he were recalculating something fundamental. Then he looked at the report, then back at her. "This is a man's work," he said. The words landed like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were delivered with such absolute certainty, such unconscious authority, as if he were stating a natural law rather than an opinion. And yet, Sauvienne heard herself reply, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "A woman did it." The Duke's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a locked door shifts when the right key finds the mechanism. "Yes," he said slowly. "She did." He turned back to the room, still holding her report, and addressed no one in particular. "Gentlemen, I believe we need to reconsider the terms of this engagement." And Sauvienne stood there, exposed, terrified, and furious, knowing that everything she'd carefully hidden had just been dragged into the light by her brother's conscience and a Duke's inconvenient intelligence. The study emptied in stages. Sir Gavin left first, muttering about unexpected developments and prior commitments, which meant he was going to tell everyone he knew. Mr. Collis shuffled out with the resignation of a man who'd just watched his professional inadequacy documented in 40 pages of elegant arithmetic. Pemberton lingered, exchanging a loaded glance with Sovian that communicated equal parts sympathy and warning before following the others. Jonathan tried to stay. The Duke asked him to leave. I'd prefer to speak with Miss Ashgrove alone, if she's amenable. The word amenable was a courtesy, not a question. Jonathan looked at Sovian, who nodded once, and he left, pulling the door shut with the careful quietness of a man who knew he'd detonated something he couldn't reassemble. The Duke returned to his desk, but didn't sit. He stood behind it, the report still in his hands, regarding Sovian across the polished mahogany like a general assessing terrain. How long have you been doing your brother's work? This is the first commission I've completed under his name. But not the first time you've done analytical work. No. My father trained me from the age of 9. Estate management, agricultural economics, accounting systems, hydraulic engineering as it applies to land drainage, tenant yield optimization. He believed competence should not be limited by circumstance of birth. An unusual philosophy. He was an unusual man. The Duke set the report down and moved to the window, his back to her. The morning light outlined his profile, the sharp jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself with the rigid control of someone who'd learned that authority required constant performance. My father died 11 months ago, he said, and the shift in subject caught Sovian off guard. He was a generous man, a beloved landlord, and a catastrophically poor manager of finances. In the months since I inherited, I've discovered debts he concealed, investments that don't exist, and rental agreements so poorly structured that half my tenants are effectively paying nothing. Your report identified problems I've been trying to articulate since I first opened the ledgers. He turned to face her. I need someone who can fix this, not diagnose it, fix it, restructure the estate finances from the ground up. It's a project that will take months, not weeks, and it requires someone with exactly the analytical capability demonstrated in that report. Sovian's breath caught. You're offering me a commission. I'm offering the person who wrote this report a commission. The fact that the person is a woman creates complications, but the alternative is hiring one of those London firms who missed the drainage problem entirely. What kind of complications? You can't work here openly as my estate analyst, a young unmarried woman poring over a bachelor duke's private financial records. The scandal would be immediate, for both of us. Then how do you propose it works? He'd clearly been thinking about this already. The answer came without hesitation. Pemberton suggested you could be engaged as a companion to my aunt, Lady Hargreave, who lives here at Hatherglen. She's elderly, largely confined to her rooms, and perpetually complaining about loneliness. In that capacity, your presence in the house would be unremarkable. Your actual work would be conducted privately in this study, with full access to the estate records. A cover story. A practical arrangement. Sovian stared at him, trying to read the calculation behind those gray eyes. And my brother? Mr. Ashgrove will be compensated for the original commission as agreed. His involvement ends there. A pause. Unless you'd prefer he continue as your front, in which case, I should tell you that your brother is a remarkably poor liar, and I will have identified the deception within a week regardless. She almost smiled. Almost. Jonathan means well. Jonathan nearly cost you everything through meaning well. But that's your concern, not mine. He moved back to the desk, pulling open a drawer and retrieving a leather folder. These are the full estate accounts. 17 ledgers spanning 8 years. I'll need a comprehensive restructuring plan within 3 months, implemented over the following 12. Sovian's mind was already working, already calculating the scope, the variables, the sheer complexity of what he was describing. It was the kind of project she'd dreamed about, the kind her father had trained her for, the kind no one would ever have offered her under her own name. What are the terms? She asked. Room and board at Hatherglen for the duration. A monthly stipend of, I meant my terms. The Duke's eyebrow rose. It was the same expression of cool assessment he'd worn when confronting Jonathan. But directed at her, it felt different. Sharper. More personal. You have terms. I have conditions. 3 of them. She saw something flicker in his eyes. Not irritation. Interest. First, she said, the work is mine. If this restructuring succeeds, I want written acknowledgement that the analysis and implementation were my intellectual contribution. Not Jonathan's, not Pemberton's. Mine. I don't need public credit, but I need the truth documented. Reasonable. Second, when the project concludes, I want letters of reference, real ones, under your seal, that I can use to secure future analytical work. I know they can't state openly what I did here, but they can attest to my capabilities in terms that would open doors. More difficult, but possible. Third, if at any point you decide my work is unsatisfactory, you tell me directly. To my face. You don't dismiss me through Pemberton, or your steward, or anyone else. You owe me the respect of honesty. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Sauvienne had the disorienting sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time by someone outside her family. Not as Jonathan's sister, or Edmund Ashgrove's daughter, or a woman out of her depth, but as a mind he recognized as equal to the problem. You negotiate like someone accustomed to being undervalued, he said. I negotiate like someone who's learned the cost of not negotiating. He extended his hand. Then we have an agreement, Miss Ashgrove. Welcome to Hatherglen. She took his hand. His grip was firm, formal, and brief. But in that moment, standing in the Duke's study with her secret exposed and her future suddenly, terrifyingly open, Sauvienne felt something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. The details were settled over the next hour, with the brisk efficiency of 2 people who preferred precision over pleasantry. Sauvienne would arrive at Hatherglen in 4 days' time, ostensibly as a companion to Lady Hargreave. Her analytical work would be conducted in the estate study during hours when the household staff were unlikely to intrude. Pemberton would manage the financial correspondence, routing documents through channels that wouldn't raise questions. Lady Hargreave will need to be told something, the Duke said, reviewing the arrangement he'd outlined on a sheet of notepaper. She's sharp despite her age, and she'll notice if her new companion spends more time with ledgers than with her. What does she know about the estate's financial difficulties? Everything. She managed this estate for 12 years after my grandfather's death, and before my father came of age. She's the reason the house is still standing. Sauvienne blinked. Your aunt managed the estate. With considerable skill, though she'd never use that word. She'd say she simply kept things tidy until the men were ready to make a mess of it again. His mouth twitched, the closest thing to warmth she'd seen from him. She may be your strongest ally here, Miss Ashgrove, if you're honest with her. And if she disapproves, then we'll have a problem, because Lady Hargreave's disapproval has a way of making problems permanent. There was the cliffhanger she didn't need, another gatekeeper standing between her and the work she'd been offered. But Sauvienne filed it away and moved to the next concern. My family will need to know the truth, my mother especially. Write to her. Explain whatever you're comfortable explaining. I'll have Pemberton arrange a monthly allowance to be sent to your family's address, presented as compensation for your companionship duties. You're paying me twice. I'm paying you once for the work you're actually doing. The companion's stipend is cover. Consider it the cost of maintaining a fiction that protects us both. Sauvienne accepted this with a nod. The mercenary clarity of the arrangement was, paradoxically, the thing she trusted most about it. There was no pretense of charity, no uncomfortable generosity, just a man who needed a problem solved, and a woman who could solve it, meeting on the only terms society would permit. "There's one more thing," the Duke said as she gathered her shawl to leave. "You should understand what you're walking into." She paused. "Meaning?" "The estate's problems are not purely financial. My father's mismanagement created factions among the tenants. Some support the restructuring. Others view any change as a threat to arrangements they've benefited from for years. Mr. Collis, my steward, falls into the latter category. He's been with Hatherglen for 30 years, and he considers any outside interference a personal insult. He'll resist. He'll sabotage, quietly, deniably, but persistently. You'll need to account for that. I already have." Sauvienne met his eyes. "Page 27 of the report addresses the steward problem directly. I recommended replacing him." The Duke's expression was unreadable. "I read page 27. And? Collis was my father's closest friend. He stood beside him at my mother's funeral. Replacing him is the correct decision, and the cruelest one. The estate can't survive his incompetence, Your Grace. Sentiment won't fix your drainage." "No," he agreed quietly. "It won't." They stood in silence for a moment, and Sauvienne understood something about this man that the report hadn't told her. He wasn't cold. He was burdened, carrying the weight of decisions that would hurt people he cared about, surrounded by people who either couldn't see the problems or couldn't face the solutions. She recognized the loneliness of competence. She'd lived with it her entire life. 4 days, he said, breaking the silence. "Pemberton will send a carriage." "I'll be ready." She turned to leave, and he spoke once more, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. "Miss Ashgrove." "Your Grace?" The report really is exceptional. It was not an apology for what he'd said earlier about a man's work. It wasn't even an acknowledgement that the statement had been wrong. But it was something, a crack in the wall of assumption, a concession that the evidence had outweighed his expectations. She should have let it go. Instead, she heard herself say, "I know." His eyebrows rose fractionally. Then, for the first time since she'd watched him hold her work in his hands and dismiss its author by gender, the Duke of Hatherglen almost smiled. Sauvienne left the study and found Jonathan waiting in the corridor, pale and wretched. "Sauvie, I'm sorry. I panicked. He was looking at me like he could see through my skull, and You told the truth. That's not something to apologize for. But the commission, the money, is handled." She took his arm, steering him toward the entrance hall. "He's offered me a position. The real work, under my own name, at least within the walls of his house." Jonathan's eyes widened. "He's keeping you on?" "As what?" "Officially, as a companion to his aunt. Unofficially, as the person who's going to save his estate from the disaster your report documented." "Your report?" "My report." She squeezed his arm. "Which you delivered. Badly, but delivered nonetheless. Thank you for that." "I nearly ruined everything." "You nearly did. But you also gave me something I couldn't have taken for myself. A chance." They stepped out into the gray morning. The Hatherglen grounds stretched before them, vast and green and troubled beneath their beauty. Fields that were slowly dying, hedgerows that concealed rotting drainage, a grand house whose elegance masked a crumbling foundation. Sauvienne looked at it all and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not since her father's accident. Not since the world had narrowed to mending and marketing and counting every farthing. Purpose. In 4 days, she'd returned to this house under a false pretense to do real work for a man who'd told her it wasn't hers to do. She'd fix his estate, earn her references, and leave with the tools to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else's name. That was the plan. Clean, professional, temporary. She didn't yet know how thoroughly that plan would fail. Hatherglen in full daylight, was a different creature than the gray-shadowed house she'd visited 4 days prior. The carriage crested the ridge at mid-morning, and Sovien's breath stalled at the sight of it. A sprawling Palladian manor of honey-colored stone, its symmetrical wings stretching outward like arms opening in reluctant welcome. The gardens were immaculate in the front, roses and clipped hedges, and a gravel drive that crunched beneath the wheels with expensive precision. But beyond the formal borders, Sovien could already see the trouble. Fences sagging in the east pasture, a barn roof patched with mismatched timber. The south fields, the ones from her drainage analysis, sitting heavy and waterlogged despite the dry week. Beautiful on the surface, rotting underneath, just like the accounts. The carriage pulled to the entrance, and a footman opened the door with practiced efficiency. Sovien stepped out carrying a single trunk and a leather satchel that contained her father's surveying instruments, 3 notebooks, and a set of mathematical tables she'd inherited, along with his conviction that numbers didn't care about your gender. The housekeeper, a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Calloway, met her at the door with the particular warmth reserved for people who'd been categorized as harmless. "Miss Ashgrove, welcome. Lady Hargrave is expecting you in the morning room. She's been looking forward to your arrival, though she'll deny it if asked." Sovien followed Mrs. Calloway through the entrance hall, absorbing everything. Portraits of Blackthorn dukes staring down with uniform severity. Marble floors scratched in patterns that told her the furniture had been rearranged recently, and not well. The scent of beeswax polish layered over something older, mustier. The smell of a house maintained through effort rather than abundance. The morning room was bright, south-facing, filled with the kind of light that exposed every flaw in the plasterwork. Lady Hargrave sat beside the window in a high-backed chair, a shawl over her knees, and a book in her lap that she clearly hadn't been reading. She was smaller than Sovien expected, shrunken by age into a compact frame, but her eyes were the same gray as her nephew's, sharp and unsparingly direct. "So," Lady Hargrave said, not rising, "you're the companion." "Yes, my lady." "Sit down. Let me look at you properly." Sovien sat. Lady Hargrave studied her the way Sovien studied balance sheets, with methodical thoroughness and no patience for decoration. "You're younger than I expected. How old are you?" 24, my lady." "Can you read aloud without mumbling?" "Yes." "Can you play the pianoforte?" "Badly." "Can you tolerate an old woman's opinions without losing your temper?" "That depends entirely on the opinions." Lady Hargreaves' mouth twitched. It was the same almost smile Sovien had seen on the Duke's face, and seeing it echoed across generations was oddly reassuring. "My nephew tells me you're clever," Lady Hargreaves said. "He doesn't use that word often. He says your father was an estate manager, and that you've inherited his aptitude for organization. He also says you'll be helping with some light clerical work in the study, which is the most transparent lie he's told since he was 9, and claimed the dog ate his Latin exercises." Sovien's composure nearly broke. "My lady, don't." Lady Hargrave held up one thin hand. "Don't insult me with the official version. I managed this estate for 12 years. I know what the study contains. I know what state the accounts are in. And I know my nephew wouldn't hire a companion for me unless that companion served a secondary purpose he considers more important." She leaned forward, her gray eyes pinning Sovien in place. "So tell me plainly, girl, what are you really here to do?" Sovien thought of the Duke's advice. "She may be your strongest ally, if you're honest with her." "I'm here to restructure the estate finances," she said. "I wrote the analytical report your nephew commissioned, the drainage assessment, the tenant revenue projections, the restructuring proposal, all of it. He's hired me to implement the recommendations." Silence. Lady Hargreaves' expression was unreadable. "You wrote the Ashgrove report," she said finally. Yes. The one Pemberton told me was the most sophisticated financial analysis he'd seen in 30 years of practice. I don't know what Pemberton told you, but yes, I wrote it. Lady Hargrave sat back in her chair, and something shifted in her face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that went deeper than the Duke's had. As if she were seeing not just Sovian, but a version of herself from decades ago, standing in a room full of men who assumed she was furniture. My brother-in-law, the previous Duke, died when his son was 14, Lady Hargrave said quietly. The solicitors suggested selling half the land. I told them I'd manage it myself. They laughed. What did you do? I managed it for 12 years, increased yields by 40%, restored 3 tenant farms everyone said were beyond saving. Her voice hardened. And when my nephew came of age, he hired a steward who undid half my work in 3 years. Collis. The name came out like a verdict. My nephew's father chose him. Loyalty over competence, sentiment over sense. The same weakness that destroyed the finances I'd spent a decade building. Sovienne understood then why the Duke had sent her to this woman first. Not for approval, but for alliance. Lady Hargrave wasn't a gatekeeper to be passed. She was a predecessor, someone who knew exactly what it meant to do invisible work in a world that refused to see you doing it. I need access to the study every morning from 7 until noon, Sovienne said. And I'll need the older ledgers, the ones from your management period, as a baseline for comparison. You'll have them. I kept copies of everything. Lady Hargreaves' eyes glinted. I also kept notes on every tenant arrangement, every drainage modification, every seed purchase. 12 years of institutional knowledge that Collis never bothered to consult. That would be invaluable. It would be the difference between success and failure, and you know it. Lady Hargrave stood, moving with surprising steadiness for a woman of her years. I'll have the boxes brought to your room tonight. And Miss Ashgrove? My lady? If you need anything in this house, come to me. Not to Sebastian, not to Pemberton, not to Mrs. Calloway. They mean well, but none of them understand what you're about to face. I do. It was the most generous thing anyone had said to Sovienne since her father told her she had the finest analytical mind he'd ever encountered. She blinked against the unexpected sting in her eyes. Thank you, my lady. Don't thank me yet. Collis has allies in this house, and he already knows something is coming. You'll need more than numbers to survive what's ahead. On that cheerful note, Lady Hargrave rang for tea and changed the subject to the afternoon's weather, with the decisive finality of a woman who considered emotional displays inefficient. Sovienne's room was on the 2nd floor, east wing, with a view of the troubled south fields. A writing desk sat beneath the window, and she unpacked her instruments and notebooks onto it, with the careful reverence of a soldier laying out weapons before battle. That evening, Lady Hargreaves' records arrived. 3 wooden crates packed with 12 years of meticulous documentation. Estate maps annotated in a precise feminine hand, crop rotation schedules, and tenant agreements with margin notes explaining the reasoning behind each term. Lady Hargrave had done this decades ago, alone, without credit, without acknowledgement, without anyone ever calling her work exceptional. Sovienne sat on the floor surrounded by another woman's hidden legacy and made a silent promise. This time, the work would be seen. 3 days into her tenure at Hatherglen, Sovienne discovered 2 things simultaneously. The first was that the estate's financial problems were significantly worse than her report had estimated. The second was that Mr. Collis was already working against her. She found the discrepancy on a Tuesday morning, cross-referencing the current tenant rolls against Lady Hargreaves' baseline records. 3 farms that had been productive under Lady Hargreaves' management were now listed as vacant, generating no revenue. But when Sovienne walked the east boundary that afternoon, under the pretense of taking air, She could see smoke rising from all 3 chimneys. The farms weren't vacant. They were occupied. Someone was collecting rent and keeping it off the books. She brought the finding to the Duke that evening. He was in the study, as he usually was after dinner, working through correspondence with focused intensity. He looked up when she entered. "Miss Ashgrove, you have that expression." "What expression?" "The one that means you've found something I'm not going to enjoy hearing." She set her notes on his desk. 3 tenant farms on the east boundary. Your records show them as vacant since last Michaelmas. Lady Hargreaves' records show them as highly productive holdings, generating a combined annual revenue of approximately £400. And? They're occupied. I walked the boundary today. All 3 are active, cultivated, with livestock and outbuildings in use. Someone renegotiated the tenancies off the books and is pocketing the income. The Duke's jaw tightened. He didn't ask who. They both knew. You're certain? I'm certain the records have been falsified. I'm certain the farms are occupied. The identity of the person responsible is, at this point, a reasonable inference rather than a proven fact. A diplomatic distinction. A necessary one. If I'm going to accuse your father's closest friend of embezzlement, I need evidence that would survive scrutiny, not just suspicion. Sebastian. She'd begun thinking of him as Sebastian, though she'd never dare use the name aloud, set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. The fire had burned low, casting the study in amber shadow. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. "Collis has been with this estate for 30 years, he said. He carried my father's coffin. And he's been stealing from your father's estate. Allegedly? The numbers don't allege, Your Grace, they state." He almost smiled at that, a ghost of expression that vanished before it fully formed. "You're very certain of your numbers." "Numbers are the only thing I've ever been certain of. People lie, ledgers lie. But mathematics, applied correctly, always tells the truth. A comforting philosophy. An accurate one." He stood and moved to the window, a habit she'd noticed, turning his back when he needed to think without being observed. The gesture was both defensive and trusting. Defensive because it hid his face. Trusting because it exposed his back to someone he barely knew. "My father trusted Collis implicitly," he said to the glass. "He trusted everyone implicitly. It was his greatest virtue and his fatal flaw. He believed people were fundamentally good, that loyalty was sufficient qualification for any responsibility that affection could substitute for competence. And you? I believe people are fundamentally self-interested, that competence is the only qualification that matters, and that trust should be earned through evidence, not assumed through sentiment. That's a lonely philosophy. It's a realistic one." The silence between them shifted. It was no longer the silence of employer and employee discussing a financial irregularity. It was something more personal, more dangerous. "I'll need a week," Sauvienne said, pulling the conversation back to professional ground. "To build a case against Collis that's airtight. I'll need access to the county land registry, the tithe records at the parish, and the original tenancy agreements from before your father's death. You'll have whatever you need. I'll also need you to behave normally around Collis. No coldness, no suspicion, no changes in routine. If he suspects I've found the discrepancy, the evidence will disappear. You're asking me to deceive a man who served my family for 3 decades. I'm asking you to protect your estate from a man who's been robbing it." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. "1 week. Build your case, Miss Ashgrove, and make it unassailable." She gathered her notes and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Your Grace?" "Yes?" "Your father wasn't wrong about everything. Trust isn't weakness. It just needs to be given to the right people." She left before he could respond, but she felt his gaze follow her out of the room, heavy with something she couldn't name and wasn't ready to examine. The next morning, she found the first warning. A note slipped under her bedroom door during the night, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Women who meddle in men's affairs come to grief. Leave Hatherglen while you still can. Sovienne read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it between the pages of her notebook, and went to the study to continue her work. She did not mention the note to anyone. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The numbers were waiting. 2 days later, a second note appeared. Same hand, same paper. The last woman who tried to manage this estate was sent away in disgrace. Ask Lady Hargreave what happened to her authority. Then ask yourself if you want the same. This time, Sovienne did ask. She brought the note to Lady Hargreave that afternoon and watched the older woman's face harden into something ancient and furious. Where did you get this? Under my door. It's the second one. The first arrived 3 days ago. Lady Hargreave held the paper to the light, studying it with the same analytical precision her nephew applied to everything. Then she set it down and folded her hands in her lap. When I managed this estate, she said, her voice controlled and flat, I dismissed 3 tenants for non-payment and restructured the drainage on the north quarter. Both decisions were correct. Both improved the estate's health significantly, and both made me enemies among men who'd profited from the previous disorder. What happened? Rumors. Whispered at first, then spoken openly, that I was unstable, that a woman managing an estate was unnatural. They wrote to my nephew's guardian. They petitioned the courts. They made my life a careful, relentless misery until the day my nephew came of age and appointed Collis in my place. Her voice didn't waver, but her knuckles were white. They didn't defeat me with arguments, Lady Hargreave continued. They couldn't. My numbers were sound, my decisions were correct, and my results were beyond dispute. So they defeated me with reputation. They made it socially impossible for me to continue. Sovienne's stomach turned cold. And Collis was part of it. Collis orchestrated it. He wanted this position. He knew he couldn't outperform me, so he outmaneuvered me instead. The room felt very quiet. He'll try the same with you, Lady Hargreave said. The notes are the beginning. Next will come the whispers, then the social pressure, then something more direct. What do you suggest? Lady Hargreave's eyes were fierce. I suggest you do what I couldn't. Build your case so thoroughly that no amount of whispering can undermine it, and find allies before he isolates you. I have allies. You, Pemberton, the Duke. Sebastian is your employer. That's not the same as an ally. Employers can be pressured, threatened, manipulated. An ally stands with you when standing becomes costly. She paused. My nephew is a good man, but he's also a man who has never had to choose between what's right and what's comfortable. When that choice comes, and it will, you need to know which way he'll fall. It was a warning wrapped in affection, the kind of truth that only someone who loved the Duke could deliver with such unflinching clarity. Sovienne took the notes back and placed them in her leather satchel. I won't be frightened away, she said. Good. Lady Hargreave picked up her book. Now read to me. Chapter 7. Sovienne read, but her mind was on the numbers, on the case she was building, on the man in the study whose trust she needed and whose attention she was beginning to want for reasons that had nothing to do with drainage. The routine established itself with the inevitability of mathematics. Mornings in the study, surrounded by ledgers and maps, building the financial architecture of a rescued estate. Afternoons with Lady Hargreave, reading aloud, walking the gardens when the weather permitted, absorbing decades of institutional knowledge that the older woman dispensed like medicine, measured, specific, and impossible to refuse. Evenings alone in her room, cross-referencing figures by candlelight until her eyes burned. And then there were the hours that belonged to no category. The late evenings when the house settled into its nighttime quiet, and Sovienne would drift back to the study for one more calculation, one more comparison, one more thread of evidence in the case she was weaving against Collis. More often than not, Sebastian was already there. They didn't plan these encounters. They didn't acknowledge them as a pattern. But by the second week, the late evening study had become a shared space, as natural as the library and someone else's story. A room where two people who spent their days performing competence could simply exist. He worked on correspondence and parliamentary business. She worked on the restructuring plan. They existed in parallel silence, broken occasionally by questions that started as professional and drifted toward personal, with the slow inevitability of water finding its level. "Your father," Sebastian said one evening, not looking up from his letter. "You said he trained you from the age of 9. Why?" Sovienne set down her pen. "Because I asked him to. He was working on a crop rotation analysis, and I looked over his shoulder and told him his barley projections were wrong. I was 9. I didn't know what a yield calculation was, but I could see the numbers didn't balance." "And he listened to a 9-year-old girl?" "He checked the figures, found I was right. Then he sat me down at his desk and said, 'If you can see what I missed, I have a responsibility to teach you what I know.' He started the next morning, never stopped until his accident." Sebastian set down his pen. "What happened?" "His horse threw him during a survey ride. He broke his back. His mind was perfect, sharp as ever, but trapped in a body that wouldn't carry him. So he poured his knowledge into you, into both of us. But Jonathan wanted to be outside, wanted to ride and charm people, the desk work, the analysis that was mine. And instead, you hide behind your brother's name." The words were blunt, but not cruel. Sovienne looked at him across the cluttered desk. "I do what's necessary. The world doesn't reward women for competence. It punishes them for displaying it. Your aunt learned that. My father understood it. That's why he trained me quietly. Why Jonathan's name goes on the work. It's not hiding. It's surviving." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Wind moved against the windows. "My mother played chess," he said, and the shift seemed random until it wasn't. Brilliantly, apparently. My father told me she could have beaten anyone in the county, but she only ever played at home, in private, because a woman who beat men at chess was considered aggressive rather than intelligent. Did she mind? My father said she laughed about it. Said the men were welcome to their pride, as long as she kept their money from the wagers. A pause. She died when I was very young. I don't remember her directly, only through my father's stories. That's its own kind of loss. Yes. He picked up a small brass compass from the desk, turning it in his fingers. My father kept this on his desk. It was hers. She used it for garden planning, of all things. Mathematical precision applied to roses. Sovienne's breath caught at the image, a woman she'd never met, applying the same rigorous mind to beauty that Sovienne applied to drainage. I understand now, she said quietly. Why you hired me. Because your report was exceptional? Because your mother taught you that women's minds are not lesser, even if you've never articulated it that way. Even if you still said, this is a man's work, when you held my report. The belief is there underneath the language. His hand stilled on the compass. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. You could have rejected the report when Jonathan confessed. You could have dismissed me, hired one of your London firms, and maintained the convention. Instead, you hired the person who wrote it, regardless of gender, That's not progressive philosophy. It's pragmatism rooted in something deeper. You're analyzing me the way you analyze ledgers. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. He set the compass down. No one has ever dissected my motivations with quite such clinical precision. Perhaps no one's been paying attention. The words landed differently than she intended. Too intimate, too knowing. She saw the moment he registered it, the slight stiffening in his shoulders, the flicker of something unguarded in his gray eyes before the control reasserted itself. "It's late," he said. "You should rest." "So should you." "I have correspondence." "You have excuses. They're not the same thing." He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt the weight of his attention like sunlight through glass, warming, illuminating, and slightly dangerous if you stood in it too long. "Good night, Miss Ashgrove." "Good night, Your Grace." She left the study carrying her notebooks and her father's compass sense, the internal certainty that told her when figures balanced and when they didn't. The numbers of her arrangement with Sebastian were beginning not to balance. There were variables she hadn't accounted for, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his mother, the way his eyes followed her across a room, the way these late-evening conversations had become the part of her day she most anticipated. She was falling. She could feel it the way she felt mathematical errors, a wrongness in the pattern, a departure from the expected trajectory. The trouble was, it didn't feel wrong at all. 3 nights later, he gave her the compass. She found it on her desk in the study the next morning, resting on top of a note in his precise handwriting. Mathematical precision, applied to whatever you choose. It should belong to someone who understands its value. Sovienne held it in her palm, feeling the weight of brass and history, and something far more frightening than Collis's anonymous threats. She should return it. It was too personal, the kind of gift that meant something beyond professional gratitude. Instead, she slipped it into the pocket of her dress, where it rested against her hip like a heartbeat. When she saw Sebastian at dinner that evening, neither of them mentioned the compass. But when their eyes met across the table, over Lady Hargreaves' commentary about the soup and Pemberton's report on the county assizes, something passed between them that required no words and no numbers. Recognition, understanding, and the terrifying knowledge that whatever this was, it had already outgrown its boundaries. Lady Hargreave watched them both with knowing gray eyes and said nothing. But that evening, she took Sovien's hand during their reading hour and held it for a moment longer than usual. "Be careful," she said softly. "Not of him, of hope. Hope is the most dangerous variable in any calculation." Sovienne didn't ask how she knew. Some things didn't require analysis. She read chapter 12 and pretended her voice wasn't shaking. The quarterly tenant assembly was Hatherglen's most important social obligation, a gathering of every family who worked the Duke's land, held in the great hall with food and ale and the pretense of communal fellowship. In practice, it was a performance of power, the Duke on display, the tenants assessing whether their landlord was strong or weak, competent or careless. Under the previous Duke, the assemblies had been warm, disorganized, and vaguely reassuring. Under Sebastian, they had become something the entire county watched, with fascinated unease. This was the assembly where Sauvienne's restructuring plan would be announced, not by her, by Sebastian, reading from a document she'd written, presenting reforms she'd designed, implementing a vision she'd built from 17 ledgers and 12 years of Lady Hargreaves' buried records. She would stand at the back of the hall, invisible again, watching her work reshape lives while her name went unspoken. She'd accepted this. It was the arrangement. She was practiced at invisibility. What she hadn't anticipated was Collis. The hall filled with tenants by mid-morning, families she'd studied as abstractions and spreadsheets, now present as flesh and faces. Farmers with weathered hands, wives in clean aprons, children restless in the corners. Sebastian stood at the front of the hall, composed and commanding. Pemberton sat to his left with legal documents. Mr. Collis sat to his right, which was the first wrong note. Sauvienne had expected Sebastian to exclude the steward from the proceedings, given what they both knew about the embezzlement. Instead, Collis sat in his usual position, his expression blandly competent, his hands folded on the table with the ease of a man who had nothing to fear. Something was wrong. Sebastian began to speak. He outlined the estate's financial difficulties with measured honesty, acknowledging his father's mismanagement without assigning blame, describing the scope of the problem with the clinical precision Sauvienne had provided. The tenants listened with the grim attention of people accustomed to bad news. Then he presented the restructuring plan. New drainage for the Southfields, renegotiated tenancy terms that would lower rents for the first 2 years while long-term improvements took effect, investment in seed stock and equipment, a complete overhaul of the accounting system, the tenants murmured. Some nodded. Others looked skeptical. One older farmer near the front raised his hand. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but who drew up this plan? We've seen plans before. The last one cost us a season's worth of labor and produced nothing." Sebastian hesitated. The fraction of a second was barely noticeable, but Sauvienne caught it. "The plan was commissioned by my solicitor and developed by an independent analyst with extensive experience in estate management." "What analyst? We'd like to know whose ideas we're staking our livelihoods on." Before Sebastian could answer, Collis spoke. "If I may, Your Grace." His voice was mild, reasonable, the practiced tone of a man who'd spent 30 years making his opinions sound like common sense. "I believe the tenants deserve full transparency. The analyst in question is Miss Sauvienne Ashgrove, who is currently residing at Hatherglen as Lady Hargreaves' companion." The hall went silent. Every face turned toward the back of the room where Sauvienne stood. She felt the attention like the notes under her door, a violence disguised as information. Collis continued, his voice carrying the length of the hall. "Miss Ashgrove is a young woman of no professional standing, no formal qualifications, and no prior experience managing an estate of this scale. She initially presented her work under her brother's name, which suggests even she recognized that her credentials were insufficient." He turned to Sebastian with manufactured concern. "I mean no disrespect. I'm simply advocating for the transparency you yourself value, Your Grace." It was masterful. Every word was technically true. Every implication was devastating. Collis hadn't attacked Sauvienne's work. He'd attacked her right to do it. Sauvienne's hands were ice, the brass compass in her pocket pressed against her hip, a small, hard anchor in a moment that felt like falling. Sebastian's face was unreadable. He looked at Collis, then at the tenants, then at Sauvienne. This was the moment Lady Hargreave had warned her about. The choice between what was right and what was comfortable. Between defending the woman who'd saved his estate and preserving the social order that made his authority possible. "Mr. Collis raises a fair point," Sebastian said, and Sauvienne's stomach dropped through the floor. "The tenants deserve transparency." He stepped around the table and walked the length of the hall until he stood beside Sauvienne. She could feel the heat of him, the steadiness of his presence, and she hated how much she wanted him to choose her in this moment, how much it would cost her if he didn't. "Miss Ashgrove wrote this plan," Sebastian said, addressing the hall from beside her rather than from his position of authority. "She wrote it under her brother's name because no solicitor would have accepted it under her own. She identified problems that 3 London firms missed. She found financial irregularities that my steward of 30 years either failed to detect or chose to conceal." The last sentence landed like a cannon shot. Collis's composure fractured. Just for an instant, a flicker of something feral behind the avuncular mask before the control reassembled. Every figure in that plan has been independently verified, Sebastian continued. Every recommendation is sound. The author's gender is irrelevant to the mathematics. And if anyone in this hall has an objection to the substance of the proposal rather than the identity of its author, I invite them to present it now. Silence. The older farmer who'd asked the original question looked at Sovian, then at the Duke, then back at Sovian. Can she explain the drainage bit? He asked. In plain terms, because begging your pardon, Your Grace, but your explanation was a bit over my head. Sebastian looked at Sovian. His expression said, This is yours. She stepped forward. Her voice shook on the first sentence, steadied on the second, and by the third, she was speaking the way she thought, clearly, precisely, with the natural authority of someone who understood her subject so thoroughly that complexity became simple. She explained the drainage. She explained the crop rotation. She answered 14 questions from skeptical farmers and won over 12 of them. She drew a diagram on the back of a broadsheet with a borrowed pencil and watched understanding dawn on faces that had been hostile 2 minutes earlier. When she finished, the hall was quiet. Then the older farmer nodded. Right, he said. That makes sense. When do we start? The applause was scattered, uncertain, but real. Not for her gender or her story or her courage, but for her competence, for the work itself. Sebastian caught her eye across the hall. He didn't smile, but something in his expression had shifted. The same look he'd had when he first read her report, except warmer now, more personal, less like assessment, and more like admiration. Collis sat at the head table, motionless, watching her with eyes that had stopped pretending to be kind. After the assembly, Sovienne found Sebastian in the corridor. Thank you, she said. I said the truth. That's not something that requires gratitude. You also publicly implied your steward is corrupt. That's going to have consequences. Yes, his jaw was set. It will. He walked away before she could ask what had changed, but she knew. He'd chosen to stand beside her rather than in front of her. He'd been tested and chosen right. The case against Collis took shape over the following week. Sovian worked through the nights, cross-referencing parish records, county registries, and the steward's personal correspondence that Pemberton obtained through channels she chose not to question. The evidence was damning. Not just the 3 ghost tenancies, but a systematic pattern of fraud spanning at least 5 years. Diverted rents, inflated maintenance costs, fictitious repairs billed to contractors who didn't exist. In total, Collis had stolen approximately £2,000, enough to imprison him, enough to destroy him. She compiled the final report on a Thursday evening, 43 pages of irrefutable evidence, and carried it to the study where Sebastian was working. He read it in silence. She watched his face as the full scope of the betrayal registered, page by page, figure by figure. When he finished, he set the report on the desk and pressed his hands flat against the surface as if steadying himself against a physical blow. £2,000, he said, at minimum. Some of the older records were destroyed, likely by Collis himself. The actual figure may be higher. My father trusted this man with everything. Yes. He invited him to Christmas. He named him in his will. He told me, on his deathbed, to rely on Collis because Collis would always be loyal. Sovian said nothing. There was nothing to say. The mathematics were complete. The human wreckage was beyond her expertise. Sebastian stood and moved to the window. The night outside was black and starless. When my father died, he said, his back to her, his voice stripped of its usual control. I was in Edinburgh, reviewing timber contracts that could have waited. But I'd been avoiding coming home because being here meant watching him decline. So I stayed in Scotland while my father died, alone, in a house full of people who loved him, and a steward who was robbing him. His voice cracked on the last word, just barely. A fracture in the edifice so fine, she might have missed it if she hadn't been listening with everything she had. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have known. I should have been here. I should have seen what Collis was doing, what the accounts looked like, what was happening to the estate my aunt spent 12 years saving. You were grieving. I was hiding." He turned, and she saw the rawness in his face, the grief he'd been burying under ledgers and correspondence, and the rigid performance of ducal authority. "That's what I do. I hide behind work, behind duty, behind the pretense that managing things competently is the same as actually living. My father loved recklessly, and it destroyed the estate. So I decided to feel nothing and manage everything. And look where it's brought me." Sauvienne crossed the room. She didn't plan it. Her body simply moved toward his pain the way her mind moved toward mathematical problems, instinctively, irresistibly, with the certainty that she could help. She stopped a foot away from him, close enough to touch, too close for employer and employee, exactly the right distance for whatever they actually were. "You feel things," she said quietly. "You feel them so intensely that you've built an entire life around containing them. That's not numbness, it's architecture." He stared at her. "Architecture. A structure designed to bear weight. Your father's death, your mother's absence, Collis's betrayal, the estate, the title, all of it. You've built walls strong enough to hold everything without collapsing. But walls aren't meant to be permanent, Sebastian. Eventually, you have to open a door." It was the first time she'd used his name. She heard it leave her mouth and felt the boundary shatter, clean and irreversible, like a figure crossing from one column to another. His hand found hers. Not the formal handshake that had sealed their arrangement, not the careful brush of fingers passing documents across a desk. His fingers interlaced with hers, holding on with a desperate gentleness that made her chest ache. "You terrify me," he said. "Good. You could use some terror. You've been far too controlled." He laughed, a real laugh, broken and beautiful, and nothing like the measured amusement he performed in company. Then his forehead dropped to hers, and they stood there, breathing the same air, suspended between the professional fiction and the personal truth. "I should tell you something," he murmured. "Then tell me." "When I said your report was a man's work, I was wrong, not just factually, morally. I was wrong, and I've regretted it every day since, but I couldn't find the words to say so because apologizing would mean admitting that my entire framework for understanding competence was built on a lie I'd never examined. That's a very long way of saying sorry. I'm sorry." "I know." She squeezed his hand. "I knew the moment you gave me the compass." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His gray eyes were unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. No assessment, no precision, just raw, terrified want. "I'm going to kiss you," he said, "and it's going to complicate everything." "Everything is already complicated. The kissing is just the variable we haven't accounted for." He kissed her. Soft at first, tentative, as if he half expected her to pull away. When she didn't, when she kissed him back with the same fierce certainty she brought to everything, he made a sound against her mouth that was part relief and part surrender. The study door opened. They sprang apart. Mrs. Calloway stood in the doorway, a tea tray in her hands, her expression transitioning from professional neutrality to startled comprehension. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I thought you might want refreshment." "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway. Please leave the tray." The housekeeper set down the tray with the carefully averted eyes of someone who'd seen nothing, would say nothing, and would remember everything. She withdrew, pulling the door shut behind her. Sauvienne's heart hammered. "How much did she see?" Enough. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair. Mrs. Calloway is discreet, but she's also loyal to this household. If she decides our association is inappropriate, she'll report it to my aunt. Your aunt already suspects. Suspecting and confirming are different things, Miss Ashgrove. The formality returned like armor reassembling. We need to be more careful. Or we need to decide what this actually is. It's dangerous, is what it is. For both of us, but especially for you. He was right. A duke caught kissing his aunt's companion would face raised eyebrows. The companion herself would face ruin. Tomorrow, Sauvienne said, we deal with Collis. We present the evidence. We handle what needs handling. And then, when the professional crisis is resolved, we talk about this. Properly. And tonight? She picked up her notebooks. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. Tonight I go to my room and pretend I can think about drainage, when all I can taste is you. She left before he could respond. Behind her, she heard the study door close, and ahead of her, climbing the stairs to her borrowed room with borrowed composure, she felt the compass in her pocket, like a promise she wasn't sure either of them could keep. The confrontation with Collis was scheduled for the following morning. It never happened the way Sauvienne planned. She came down to breakfast to find a stranger at the table, a tall, elegantly dressed woman in her middle 50s, with ice blonde hair and the kind of beauty that age had refined, rather than diminished. She sat at the head of the table as if she owned it. "Ah," the woman said, setting down her teacup. "The companion." Sebastian appeared in the doorway behind Sauvienne, his expression rigid. "Miss Ashgrove, may I introduce my mother's sister, Lady Octavine Sayburn. She arrived unexpectedly this morning." Unexpectedly is a strong word. Lady Octavine's smile was polished and cold. "I received a letter from Mr. Collis, expressing concern about certain developments at Hather Glen. As the executor of my late sister's trust and a significant creditor to this estate, I felt obliged to investigate." Sauvienne's blood went cold. Collis hadn't waited to be caught. He'd struck first. Lady Octavine turned her polished smile on Sauvienne. "Mr. Collis tells me you've been conducting an audit of the estate finances. An unauthorized audit, performed by someone with no formal qualifications, no professional standing, and no legitimate reason to access confidential financial records." "Miss Ashgrove was commissioned by me," Sebastian said, his voice tight. "Commissioned to do what, exactly?" "Mr. Collis's letter suggests she's been making accusations against members of your household staff, undermining the authority of your steward, and conducting herself in ways that are professionally and personally inappropriate." The word personally landed like a blade. Sauvienne saw Sebastian flinch. "I'm also told," Lady Octavine continued, her voice carrying the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, "that Miss Ashgrove initially submitted her work under her brother's name. A deception that, regardless of its motivation, calls into question both her integrity and her judgment." "The work speaks for itself," Sauvienne said, finding her voice. "Does it? Because Mr. Collis tells me the work contains significant errors, and that your conclusions about his management are based on incomplete data and personal animosity." "Mr. Collis is lying." "That's a very serious accusation, Miss Ashgrove." "It's a very serious crime, Lady Sayburn." The room went still. Lady Octavine's eyes narrowed. Sebastian stepped forward. "Aunt Octavine, I assure you, the audit is legitimate, and the findings can wait." Lady Octavine stood. "What cannot wait is the question of propriety. I've spoken with Mrs. Calloway this morning." Sauvienne's stomach plummeted. The tea tray, the opened door, the housekeeper who saw nothing but forgot nothing. "It appears," Lady Octavine said, each word precise and merciless, "that Miss Ashgrove's relationship with my nephew has exceeded the boundaries of professional engagement. Whatever the quality of her analytical work, her continued presence in this house is inappropriate and damaging to this family's reputation. "That is not your decision to make," Sebastian said, but his voice had lost its authority. He sounded like a nephew, not a duke. "No, it's yours, and I'm asking you to make it correctly." Lady Octavine moved to the door. "I've arranged for Mr. Collis to present his response to Miss Ashgrove's allegations this afternoon. I've also invited Sir Gavin Naismith and 2 other county magistrates to hear both sides. If Miss Ashgrove's evidence is as compelling as you believe, it will survive scrutiny. If it isn't, then I expect this situation to be resolved appropriately." She left. The silence she left behind felt like wreckage. "She's going to destroy the case," Sovian said, her voice flat. "Collis has had time to prepare. He's contacted her, briefed her, probably altered evidence. By this afternoon, the records I need will have been modified, or missing. We still have your report, your copies." "My copies prove what the numbers were. His copies will show something different. It becomes my word against his, and I'm a woman with no credentials who was caught kissing her employer." The word kissing made them both flinch. "I'll protect you," Sebastian said. "You can't. Not from this. Your aunt is your mother's sister and a creditor to the estate. Collis is a 30-year servant with allies among the tenants and the county magistrates. I'm a companion who exceeded her position." She could hear her own voice growing cold, analytical, retreating into the mathematics of the situation because the emotions were unbearable. "The calculation is simple. Defending me costs you your aunt's support, your steward's cooperation, and your reputation. Defending Collis costs you nothing except the truth. The truth matters. Does it? Does it matter enough to risk everything?" He reached for her hand. She stepped back. "Don't," she whispered. "If you touch me now, I'll stay. And staying will destroy us both." She went upstairs. She packed her trunk. She placed the compass on the writing desk, then stood staring at it for a long moment, before snatching it back and pressing it into her pocket. Some things couldn't be left behind, even when leaving was the right decision. Beside the empty space where the compass had briefly rested, she placed a note written in steady handwriting that cost her more effort than any column of figures ever had. "Your Grace, my continued presence at Hatherglen compromises both the restructuring project and your personal standing. I've left complete copies of all evidence regarding Mr. Collis's financial misconduct in the locked drawer of the study desk. The key is with Pemberton. The numbers are sound. They will speak for themselves, as they always do. I wish you every success. Sovian Ashgrove." She sealed the letter. She did not write, "I love you," because love, she had learned, was not a variable you could control, and putting it on paper would make it permanent in a way she wasn't brave enough to face. She left Hatherglen at noon in a hired carriage, without saying goodbye to Lady Hargrave, because she knew the older woman would talk her out of leaving, and she couldn't afford to be talked out of it. The south fields stretched green and troubled in the carriage window. The drainage was still wrong. The numbers were still waiting. Sovian pressed the compass, which she hadn't been able to leave behind after all, against her chest, and did not cry. She would fix that later, in the privacy of her father's house, where no one expected her to be extraordinary. Home was unchanged. That was the cruelest part. The same modest rooms, the same worn furniture, the same smell of bread and laundry soap. Her father in his chair by the window, a blanket over his useless legs and a book in his hands. Her mother at the stove, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. Jonathan in the corner, avoiding her eyes because guilt was the one emotion her brother could never successfully hide. "You're back early," her father said. Not a question. The position ended sooner than expected. Did it? Or did you end it? Edmund Ashgrove had lost the use of his legs, but none of his precision. He studied his daughter, the way she studied balance sheets, with methodical thoroughness and no patience for evasion. "Both," Sauvienne said. "Sit down. Tell me." She told him. Not everything. She couldn't bring herself to describe the kiss or the compass or the way Sebastian's forehead had felt against hers, but enough. The report, the arrangement, the discovery of Collis's fraud, Lady Octavine's arrival, the impossible position she'd been placed in. Her father listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You left your evidence behind," he said finally. "Yes, in the study desk. Pemberton has the key." "And you trust the Duke to use it?" "I trust the numbers to speak for themselves." "That's not what I asked." Her father leaned forward, his ruined body somehow still radiating the authority of the man who'd taught her everything. "Numbers don't act, Sauvienne. People do. Do you trust him?" The question opened a wound she'd been trying to keep closed. "I don't know." "Yes, you do. You're afraid of the answer, but you know it." He let his aunt walk into that room and dismantle everything. He stood there and let it happen. Did he? Or did he simply not react quickly enough? There's a difference between complicity and being outmaneuvered. Her father's eyes were gentle. "You've been outmaneuvered yourself by Collis, and running was your response." "I didn't run. I calculated the odds and withdrew." "Those are the same thing, dressed in different mathematics." The words hit harder than Lady Octavine's accusations because they were true. Sauvienne had done what she always did when the human variables overwhelmed the numerical ones. She'd retreated to the safety of logic, declared the equation unsolvable, and walked away before the solution could prove her wrong. 3 days passed. She helped her mother with the mending. She reviewed her father's old case files, looking for work she could take on, estates that might need anonymous analysis. She read Byron by candlelight and didn't think about Sebastian, except constantly. On the 4th morning, Pemberton arrived. He came in a hired carriage, looking rumpled and road-weary, and entirely unlike the composed solicitor she'd worked with at Hatherglen. He sat in her mother's parlor, accepted tea, and spoke without preamble. The hearing happened. Collis presented his defense. Lady Octavine presided. The magistrates listened. And? "The Duke presented your evidence. All 43 pages. He'd memorized the key figures. He walked the magistrates through every discrepancy, every falsified record, every missing payment, citing your analysis by name and attributing every finding to you specifically." Sauvienne's breath stopped. "He also," Pemberton continued, "publicly dismissed Collis from his position, repaid the stolen funds from his personal accounts, pending legal recovery, and informed Lady Octavine that if she found his management of the estate unsatisfactory, she was welcome to petition the courts, where she would find his financial records in perfect order, thanks to the work of Miss Sauvienne Ashgrove." The room was very quiet. Sauvienne's mother had stopped pretending to work. Her father was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "He also asked me to deliver this." Pemberton produced a letter, thick and sealed with the blackthorn crest. Sauvienne took it. Her hands trembled. "He didn't ask me to bring you back," Pemberton said carefully. "He was very specific about that. He said the decision to return must be entirely yours, made without pressure, without obligation, and without any concern for his feelings." "That sounds like him." "It does." Pemberton stood. "I'll be at the inn in town until tomorrow morning. If you decide to come, the carriage will be waiting." He left. Sauvienne held the letter without opening it. Her father's voice came quietly from his chair. "You said you didn't know if you trusted him." "I know now." "Then why are you still holding the letter instead of reading it?" "Because once I read it, I'll have to decide. And deciding means either going back and risking everything, or staying here and being safe." Safe, her father repeated, with the particular inflection of a man who'd spent 15 years in a chair, watching the world through a window. I chose safe, Sovian. After my accident, after the business collapsed, I chose safety. I retreated to this chair and this room and these books, and I told myself it was enough. Do you want to know the truth? Tell me. It's not enough. Safety without purpose is just a slower kind of dying. Sovian opened the letter. Sebastian's handwriting was precise, as everything about him was precise, but the letter itself was not. It was messy, unstructured, the words of a man who had abandoned his usual architecture and written from the wreckage. Sovian, I presented your case. Every page, every figure, every finding. Collis has been dismissed and will face criminal proceedings. The magistrates were unanimous. Your work was, as you would say, unassailable. Lady Octavine was less easily convinced, but the numbers did what you promised they would. They spoke for themselves. I should have spoken sooner. In the dining room, when my aunt was dismantling your credibility, I should have stopped her immediately. I didn't. Not because I agreed with her, but because for one terrible moment, I fell back into the habit of a lifetime, the habit of calculating consequences before acting, of measuring costs before speaking, of choosing what was safe over what was right. You were right to leave. You deserved better than my hesitation. But I need you to know what happened after you left. Lady Hargreave came to my study that evening. She brought a box of her old records, the ones she'd given you, and set them on my desk. She said, "Your father replaced me with a man who stole from this family. Don't you dare replace her with your cowardice." Then she left. She didn't speak to me for 2 days. I spent those 2 days reading your work. All of it. Not just the Collis evidence, but the full restructuring plan. Every annotation. Every margin note. I read the work of a mind that sees the world more clearly than anyone I've ever known, and I understood finally what my mother's compass meant. Not just mathematical precision, but moral precision. The courage to see what's true and act on it, regardless of the cost. I failed that standard. You never have. I'm not asking you to return to Hatherglen. I'm not asking you to forgive my hesitation or resume our arrangement. I'm asking you to know that your work stands. Your name is attached to it, publicly and permanently. Pemberton has your letters of reference, signed and sealed. Whatever you choose to do next, you'll do it as Sovian Ashgrove, estate analyst, author of the Hatherglen Restructuring, with my full and unreserved endorsement. If you do choose to return, it won't be as my aunt's companion. It won't be as a secret analyst working behind a closed door. It will be as yourself, in whatever capacity you decide, with whatever title you claim. And if you don't return, I'll understand. But I want you to know that the study is very quiet without you. The numbers are still waiting. And so am I. Sebastian. Sovienne read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it in her pocket beside the compass, and stood. Mother, I need my trunk repacked. Her mother was already moving. The carriage ride back to Hatherglen took 4 hours. Sovienne spent them with the compass in one hand and the letter in the other, alternating between fierce certainty and paralyzing doubt. Pemberton met her at the door. "He's in the study," Pemberton said. "Of course he is." She found him at his desk, surrounded by her work, her reports and annotations spread across every surface. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face nearly undid her. "You came back." "I read the letter. And you're right. You should have spoken sooner. Your hesitation was a failure, and I have every right to be angry about it. You do. I'm also standing in your study, which suggests my anger has limits." She moved closer. "Your aunt?" "Departed yesterday. furious but reconciled to the reality that the evidence against Collis is incontrovertible. She'll come around. She always does when the numbers are clear. Lady Hargrave? Currently in the morning room, pretending she isn't watching the front drive for your carriage. She'll deny it. Collis? Awaiting trial. The county prosecutor was very impressed with the quality of the evidence. He asked who compiled it, and I told him. You told him my name. Your name, your qualifications, your methodology. He's asked if you'd be willing to serve as expert witness at the trial. The ground shifted beneath Sovien's feet. Not metaphorically. She actually swayed, and Sebastian was there, his hands on her arms, steadying her with the same careful strength that had steadied his estate. Expert witness, she repeated, in a county court, under your own name, presenting your own work. That's never been done. A woman testifying as an expert on estate management. Many things that have never been done are simply things that haven't been done yet. He held her gaze. Your words. Page 31, paragraph 4, in reference to the Southfield drainage conversion. You memorized my report. I memorized everything about you. His hands tightened on her arms. Sovien, I need to say this properly. Not in a letter, not through Pemberton, not in the margins of a financial document. Then say it. I love you. Not despite your mind, but because of it. Not because you saved my estate, but because you made me want to deserve saving. You walked into my study and took apart everything I believed about competence and gender and authority, and you replaced it with something true. I love your precision and your courage and the way you hold a pen like it's a weapon. I love that you left when I failed you, and I love that you came back when I earned it. You haven't quite earned it yet. Then tell me what's left. Sovien reached into her pocket and pulled out the compass. She placed it on the desk between them. Your mother's compass. Mathematical precision applied to whatever I choose. She met his eyes. I choose this. But not as your secret. Not as your companion. Not as a woman hiding behind a closed door. I want my name on the restructuring. I want the expert witness testimony. I want a life where my work belongs to me, openly, permanently, regardless of who approves. Done. I'm not finished. She took a breath. I also want you, but not the Duke of Hatherglen performing his duties. I want the man who laughed in his study and admitted he was terrified. I want the man underneath the architecture. Sebastian picked up the compass and placed it back in her hand, closing her fingers around it. The compass was my mother's, he said. My father told me to give it to someone who would understand its value. I didn't understand what he meant until I met you. He lifted her hand, compass and all, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. You can have the man underneath the architecture. He's been waiting for someone brave enough to knock. Sovien laughed. It was wet and broken and real, nothing like the composed control she wore like armor. We're going to scandalize the entire county, she said. Undoubtedly. Your aunt will never forgive you. She'll forgive the balance sheets. The rest will follow. Lady Hargrave? We'll say she predicted this in the first week and claim full credit. Sovien kissed him. Not softly, not tentatively, but with the full force of a woman who had spent her life being invisible and was done with it. He kissed her back with equal conviction, and somewhere in the house, she was almost certain she heard Lady Hargrave's voice saying, "It's about time." 18 months later, Sovien stood in the county courthouse, watching the magistrate review the final page of her testimony. The courtroom was full. Farmers, solicitors, county officials, and a handful of journalists from the regional press who'd heard about the unusual case of a woman serving as expert witness in a financial fraud trial. Collis sat at the defendant's table, diminished, stripped of his avuncular mask, a small man caught in the net of very large numbers. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was 5 years. Sovian felt nothing triumphant, only the quiet satisfaction of a proof completed, an equation balanced, a truth that had been spoken and heard. Outside the courthouse, Sebastian waited with the carriage. He was leaning against the door in a posture so casual it had to be deliberate, and when he saw her, he straightened with the particular expression of a man who would never stop being slightly astonished by the woman he loved. "The county prosecutor wants to hire you," he said. "I know. He mentioned it during the recess. Are you going to accept? I'm considering it. The pay is terrible, but the precedent would be extraordinary." He opened the carriage door for her. "Whatever you decide." "Whatever I decide." She climbed in, and he followed, settling beside her on the seat. Their shoulders touched. He didn't move away. Neither did she. The restructuring of Hatherglen was complete. The South Fields drained properly for the first time in a decade, producing yields that exceeded even Sovian's projections. The tenants were prospering. The accounts were balanced. Lady Hargreave had asked Sovian to co-author a manual on estate management for women, which they worked on together every afternoon, arguing about methodology with passionate precision. Lady Octavine had not forgiven them, but she had attended the wedding, sitting in the front pew with an expression that suggested she was enduring rather than celebrating. When Sovian, in a moment of reckless courage, had asked her to dance at the reception, Lady Octavine had refused, then reconsidered, then danced one stiff, formal quadrille and said afterward, "You're competent. I despise the situation, but I respect the arithmetic." It was, Sovian decided, the highest compliment the woman was capable of producing. Jonathan had found legitimate work as an assistant to Pemberton, where his natural charm and inability to lie convincingly made him surprisingly effective at witness interviews. Her father came to Hatherglen once, carried into the study in his chair by 2 footmen. He sat behind the desk, surveyed the ledgers, the maps, the careful annotations in his daughter's hand, and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "You've exceeded everything I taught you. You taught me everything I know. No, I taught you the mathematics. The courage was yours." That evening, after her father had been settled into the guest room and the house had quieted to its nighttime hum, Sovian sat alone in the study. Sebastian's study. Their study. She opened the center drawer and found, tucked beneath the estate seal, a letter in unfamiliar handwriting. Old paper, old ink. She recognized the hand from Lady Hargreave's records. It was the previous Duke's. "To whoever loves my son, I hope you are reading this, because Sebastian has finally let someone close enough to find it. He will have resisted. He will have built walls and buried himself in work and convinced himself that duty is sufficient substitute for happiness. He is wrong. My wife understood numbers the way musicians understand melody, not as cold abstraction, but as the hidden order beneath everything beautiful. She taught me that love and precision are not opposites. They are the same impulse, the desire to see clearly and act accordingly. If you are reading this, you have broken through my son's defenses. Thank you. He deserves to be known, not just obeyed. He deserves to be challenged, not just supported. He deserves someone who will look at his careful architecture and say, 'This is extraordinary. But where is the door?' Be that door. And if my old compass has found its way to you, know that it carries my wife's blessing and my gratitude, with love and mathematical precision. Richard Blackthorne, Duke of Hatherglen." Sovian held the letter in one hand and the compass in the other, and the tears she'd been managing for 18 months finally fell. She was still sitting there when Sebastian found her. "What's this?" he asked, then saw the handwriting. His face went white. Your father left it in the desk, for whoever found it. Sebastian took the letter with hands that shook. He read it standing, then read it again sitting, then set it on the desk and gripped the edges the way he always did when he needed to anchor himself against something enormous. He knew, Sebastian said. He knew I'd need this. He knew you. Sovienne moved to stand behind his chair, her hands on his shoulders. That's all. He knew his son. Sebastian reached up and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that, in the quiet study, surrounded by balanced ledgers and solved problems, and the ghost of a man who'd believed that love and precision were the same impulse. Thank you, Sebastian said. For what? For knocking. Outside the study windows, the south fields of Hatherglen stretched green and thriving in the late afternoon light. The drainage was correct. The yields were rising, the numbers balanced. And in the study, the Duke of Hatherglen and the woman who'd written his salvation held hands over a dead man's letter and a brass compass. Proof that sometimes the most extraordinary work begins with someone brave enough to claim it. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in voices that refuse to be silenced, in minds that demand to be recognized, in love that grows not from convenience, but from the courage to be truly seen. Your presence makes this space meaningful, and I'm grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Did a particular moment stay with you? A line, a scene, a turning point? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what resonates, and what kinds of stories to create next. Consider subscribing if you'd like more stories with emotional depth, fierce heroines, and endings that feel earned and true. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.